My name is Chloe Sterling. I am 34 years old, a master automotive engineer and the majority shareholder of Sterling Global Logistics, and for the last 15 years, I have been the invisible stain on my family's pristine reputation. A woman's place in this family is behind a desk or on a husband's arm, not covered in grease like a common street mechanic, my father spat, his voice echoing across the $12,000 mahogany table at the Lakeside Country Club in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was a humid Saturday evening in June, the kind where the air feels heavy with the scent of expensive jasmine and the unearned arrogance of the 1%. 50 guests, draped in tailored Tom Ford tuxedos and custom silk Vera Wang gowns, paused their conversations to laugh into their crystal flutes of Krug champagne, the bubbles rising in unison with their mockery. I stood there at the edge of the ballroom, the black oil under my fingernails a stark, jarring contrast to the champagne-colored lace of the dress my mother had forced me to wear. My father, Richard Sterling, was a man who measured worth in equity and bloodlines. He looked at me that night not as his daughter, but as a faulty investment. I was 19 then, a sophomore struggling through the grueling curriculum of mechanical engineering, and earlier that morning, Richard had discovered my secret. He had found the 2008 midnight blue Porsche 911 Carrera S hidden in the back of our secondary carriage house, a car I had bought for $4,000 with saved waitress tips and was painstakingly rebuilding from the chassis up. To him, the sight of his daughter using a snap-on torque wrench instead of a leather-bound planner was an insult to the Sterling name. He told everyone at that table, with a smirk that felt like a physical blow, that I was a disappointment who couldn't even pass a basic calculus exam, let alone run a company. He didn't know that I had failed that exam because I was spent 48 hours straight diagnosing a fuel injection issue for a local shop to pay for my tuition. Nor did he care. The humiliation was a cold, sharp blade. I remember the specific smell of the room, a mixture of Oribe hairspray, expensive cigar smoke, and the faint metallic tang of the silver-plated serving trays carrying hors d'oeuvres that cost more than my monthly rent. I looked at my mother, Eleanor, who was busy adjusting her 30-carat Harry Winston necklace, her eyes carefully avoiding mine. She didn't defend me. In the Sterling household, silence was the price of comfort. I walked out of that country club while the laughter was still ringing in the rafters, the heels of my shoes clicking against the Italian marble floors of the foyer. I didn't take the 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class he had bought me as a leash. I walked 3 miles in the dark to that carriage house, started the rough, coughing engine of my half-finished Porsche, and drove away from Greenwich with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning, singular need to prove that the grease under my nails was worth more than the gold on his table. For the next decade, I lived in the spaces Richard Sterling refused to acknowledge. While my sister, Beatrice, was busy marrying a hedge fund manager and spending $60,000 on nursery wallpaper in a renovated brownstone on the Upper East Side, I was in a grime-streaked workshop in Detroit. I started as a junior technician at a high-end performance shop, earning $22 an hour, barely enough to cover the $900 rent on my studio apartment where the heater rattled like a dying tractor and the windows let in the biting Michigan frost. I lived on black coffee and $3 protein bars, saving every cent for certifications. I became a specialist in European luxury engines, the kind that required surgical precision and a deep understanding of thermodynamics. My father had blocked my phone number a month after I left, and my mother only sent generic holiday cards with no return address, usually containing a $100 bill that I never spent, keeping them in a shoebox as a reminder of what they thought my soul was worth. By the time I was 28, I had transitioned from the garage floor to the design suite. I moved to Stuttgart, Germany, taking a position with a major automotive firm. My life became a blur of wind tunnels, CAD software, and the high-pitched whine of electric drivetrains being tested to their breaking points. I wasn't just fixing cars anymore. I was inventing the systems that made them obsolete. I earned my first patent for a high-efficiency thermal management system for lithium-ion batteries at 29. The royalties from that patent alone started bringing in 6 figures quarterly, but I didn't buy a mansion or a mahogany table. I lived in a modest flat, drove a meticulously maintained 2021 Audi RS6 Avant that I tuned myself, and started buying up distressed debt in the logistics sector. Specifically, I started buying the debt of Sterling Global Logistics. My father's empire was a house of cards built on the assumption that global trade would never fluctuate and that his name alone was enough to satisfy creditors. By 2023, the cracks were showing. High interest rates and a series of failed acquisitions in the European market had left Sterling Global vulnerable. Richard, ever the egoist, refused to downsize. He kept the $5 million vacation home in Aspen and the Gulfstream G65. Oh, even as his quarterly reports began to bleed red. He was desperate for a bailout, a silent partner who would inject $50 million of capital without asking too many questions about his management style. He thought he was looking for a faceless venture capital firm. He didn't realize he was looking for me. The day of the final board meeting arrived 3 weeks ago. I flew back to Connecticut, landing at Westchester County Airport in a private jet I now owned through a holding company. I wore a charcoal gray suit from Savile Row, the fabric so fine it felt like liquid, and a pair of vintage Patek Philippe cufflinks. I didn't look like a mechanic. I looked like the person who was about to dismantle his life. The meeting was held in the same mahogany-paneled boardroom where he had once told me I would never amount to anything. The air was thick with the scent of desperation and stale coffee from the Starbucks downstairs, a sharp contrast to the high-end catering of his glory days. Richard was sitting at the head of the table, looking older, his skin sallow and his hands shaking slightly as he shuffled through the foreclosure notices. When I walked in, he didn't recognize me at first. I had changed. My hair was shorter, my posture was military straight, and the softness of my youth had been replaced by the hard, angular lines of a woman who had built her own world. He looked up, his brow furrowed, and asked who I was representing. I didn't say a word. I simply sat down in the chair directly opposite him, tossed a black leather folder onto the table, and watched as he opened it. Inside were the documents proving that I, through Sterling Holdings LLC, now owned 64% of his company's voting shares and 90% of his personal debt, including the lien on the very house I grew up in. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a total structural collapse. He looked at the signature on the bottom of the documents, then back up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Chloe?" he whispered, his voice cracking. I leaned forward, the light catching the sharp edges of my watch. I remember the exact moment the realization hit him. It wasn't just that I was successful. It was that I was the one holding the leash. I told him that the first order of business as the new owner was to liquidate the Gulfstream, sell the Aspen property, and terminate his salary effective immediately. I told him that a man's place in this company was in the retirement home, not behind a desk he couldn't manage. I watched as the man who had once humiliated me in front of 50 people slumped in his chair, the mahogany table he loved so much. Now nothing more than a piece of furniture I would likely replace with something more functional. There was no joy in the moment, only a profound sense of closure. I wasn't the disappointment. I was the consequence of his arrogance. I walked out of that building and stepped into the back of a black 2024 Cadillac Escalade, the leather interior smelling of success and new beginnings. As we drove away, I looked at my hands. They were clean now, but I could still feel the phantom weight of that first torque wrench, a reminder that resilience is built in the dirt, not in the ballroom. Family is a word people use to justify their expectations, but loyalty is something earned through support, not demanded through bloodlines. Richard Sterling had spent 30 years building a monument to himself, and it took his grease-covered daughter less than an hour to turn it into a footnote in her own story. I looked out the window at the passing Connecticut landscape, the rolling hills and the gated estates, and for the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like the architect of my own destiny, and the view from the top was far clearer than it had ever been from the bottom of a repair pit. The debt was settled, the records were closed, and the sterling name finally belonged to someone who knew the value of hard work. The contrast between my reality and the gilded existence of my brother Ethan was not just unfair, it was a brutal daily assault on my sense of worth that shaped the very core of my ambition. While I was scrubbing the carbon deposits off intake valves and inhaling the caustic scent of brake cleaner, Ethan was the undisputed golden child of the Sterling dynasty, a title he wore with a reckless indifference that bordered on the sociopathic. I remember the morning in mid-July when the disparity reached a fever pitch of absurdity, a moment that remains etched in my mind with the clarity of a high-definition photograph. At 22, Ethan had managed to lose control of his Guardsman red $145,000 Porsche 911 Turbo while speeding down a residential street in Paradise Valley, shearing off a cast-iron fire hydrant and sending a geyser of water 50 feet into the desert sky. The car, a masterpiece of German engineering with its twin turbocharged flat-six engine, was reduced to a crumpled heap of aluminum and expensive leather, the airbags deployed like white flags of surrender. My father didn't scream, he didn't lecture, and he certainly didn't make Ethan face the consequences of his negligence. Instead, Richard simply made a phone call to his contact at the local dealership, and by 10 o'clock the next morning, a flatbed truck arrived at our gates to deliver a brand new, even more powerful replacement, a 2024 chalk gray Turbo S with carbon ceramic brakes and a custom Bordeaux red interior that smelled of absolute privilege. Meanwhile, I was living in a parallel universe defined by grit, exhaustion, and the relentless pursuit of self-reliance. I was working 65 hours a week at a local independent garage called Apex Automotive, a place where the air was always thick with the sound of pneumatic impact wrenches and the heavy, humid heat of the Arizona sun reflecting off the asphalt. My fingernails were permanently stained with a deep obsidian oil that no amount of industrial-strength Gojo soap could ever fully remove, a physical manifestation of the distance I had put between myself and the high society luncheons my mother attended. I was saving every single cent of my $18 an hour wage, a pittance compared to the weekly allowance my father funneled into Ethan's account for bottle service and designer streetwear. Every dollar was a brick in the wall I was building to protect myself from ever needing them again. I tracked my expenses on a crumpled spreadsheet, calculating the cost of every gallon of milk and every liter of synthetic motor oil with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. I knew that my survival depended on my ability to endure the grind that my brother couldn't even imagine, a world where things didn't just appear because you wanted them, but because you bled for them. The physical environment of our lives offered a visual representation of this divide that was almost comical in its extremity. My parents lived in a sprawling 9,000-square-foot Mediterranean-style mansion in the hills of North Scottsdale, a monument to excess featuring reclaimed French limestone floors, a temperature-controlled wine cellar housing 4,000 bottles, and an infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the valley below. The house was a climate-controlled fortress where the monthly cooling bill alone reached $2,400, a staggering sum that could have covered my living expenses for 3 months. I can still picture the heavy, velvet curtains in their master suite, the way the air conditioning hummed with a quiet, expensive efficiency, and the way the servants moved silently through the halls like ghosts, tending to the whims of living gods. In that house, reality was whatever Richard Sterling decided it was, and his reality didn't include a daughter who preferred the smell of 10W30 to the scent of Chanel No. 5. In stark, humiliating contrast, I retreated every night to a 550-square-foot studio apartment on the industrial edge of Phoenix, a space that felt less like a home and more like a holding cell for my ambitions. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the rhythmic clanking of the freight trains passing by at 3 in the morning, and the air inside was a permanent, suffocating mixture of old tires, burnt coffee, and the faint, sweet smell of a coolant leak from the radiator under the window. I slept on a used mattress I had bought for $50 from a closing motel, its springs groaning under my weight as I collapsed into a dreamless sleep, too tired to even take off my work boots some nights. There was no marble here, only linoleum that was peeling at the corners, and a single, buzzing fluorescent light fixture in the kitchen that cast a sickly green hue over everything I owned. My dinner was often a lukewarm can of soup eaten directly from the pot to save on dish soap, while I watched the flicker of the streetlights outside, wondering if my father ever looked at the empty seat at his mahogany table and felt even a flicker of regret. But the most painful part wasn't the poverty or the physical toll on my body. It was the psychological warfare of being erased. I was the invisible daughter, the one whose name was only mentioned in hushed, disappointed tones when the neighbors asked why I wasn't at the latest charity gala for the Phoenix Children's Hospital. My father had a way of looking through me, as if I were a ghost haunting his perfect life, a reminder of a failure he couldn't quite explain away. He would sit in his leather-bound study, sipping a 20-year-old Highland Park scotch that cost $400 a bottle, and talk about Ethan's future as if it were a foregone conclusion of greatness. He ignored the fact that Ethan had dropped out of 3 different business schools and had no more understanding of logistics than he did of humility. To Richard, the image was everything, and Ethan looked the part of the heir, while I, with my calloused hands and my grease-stained Dickies work pants, looked like a mistake that needed to be buried. I remember one specific evening when I had stopped by the mansion to pick up a box of my old textbooks that I hoped to sell for a few extra dollars. As I walked through the heavy, wrought-iron front doors, I saw Ethan sprawled on the Italian leather sofa, playing video games on a massive 85-inch Sony Bravia television while a personal chef prepared a 3-course meal in the kitchen. He didn't even look up as I passed, just let out a dismissive snort and told me I smelled like a junkyard. My mother was nearby, arranging a bouquet of $200 peonies in a baccarat crystal vase, her movements stiff and performative. She looked at my dirt-caked work boots on her pristine rug and sighed, a sound of pure, unadulterated shame. I didn't stay long. I took my box of books and walked back out to my beat-up truck, the engine of which I had rebuilt 3 times just to keep it running. As I drove back to my small, dark studio, I realized that the luxury of that mansion was a cage, and my poverty was a forge. They were comfortable, but I was becoming dangerous. I was learning the mechanics of the world, quite literally, while they were only learning how to consume it. The resentment I felt wasn't a hot, impulsive anger, but a cold, calculated resolve that settled into my bones like the desert frost. I began to view my life as a series of technical problems to be solved, applying the same logic to my finances that I did to a faulty transmission. If a gear was slipping, you didn't just ignore it. You opened the casing, identified the worn teeth, and replaced the part. My family was the worn gear, a legacy of entitlement that was destined to fail because it lacked the structural integrity of hard work. I started taking on side jobs, fixing the cars of the other mechanics' friends, working until my eyes burned and my hands cramped. I was making $25 under the table for every oil change and $50 for every brake job, stuffing the cash into an old metal ammo box hidden under my floorboards. I was building my own capital, one greasy $20 bill at a time, while my father continued to bleed money into Ethan's bottomless vanity. Every night in that studio, as I lay on that lumpy, uncomfortable mattress, I would close my eyes and visualize the future. I didn't see myself in a ball gown or at a country club. I saw myself in a boardroom, holding the deeds to everything Richard Sterling loved. I saw the look on Ethan's face when he realized that the sister he mocked was the one who controlled his allowance. The smell of old tires and burnt coffee became my motivation, a sensory reminder of where I came from and what I was willing to endure to get where I was going. I was no longer just Chloe Sterling, the disappointment. I was a precision instrument being calibrated for a single, devastating purpose. The $2,400 cooling bill and the 9,000 square feet of wasted space were nothing more than targets on a map I was carefully drawing in the dark. I knew that one day the fire hydrants of the world wouldn't be enough to stop the flood I was preparing to unleash on the people who thought $18 an hour was the measure of my soul. I was patient, I was skilled, and I was fueled by a type of hunger that a golden child would never understand. the kind of hunger that only grows in the quiet, desperate corners of a $50 mattress in a room that smells like a garage. Each passing day of toil was a lesson in the fragility of their world and the durability of mine, a contrast that was indeed brutal, but ultimately the very thing that ensured I would be the only one left standing when the gilded walls finally came crashing down. I was 21 years old, standing on the cooling asphalt of the Phoenician Resort's parking lot, and for the first time in my life, the weight of the Sterling name felt like a shackle I had finally snapped. The muffled sound of the 40th anniversary gala's jazz band was still audible in the distance, a mocking rhythm that celebrated a future I was no longer a part of. Harrison had made it clear. To him, I was a grease monkey, a utility to be used until the gears ground down, while Ethan was the golden heir to a kingdom he hadn't the slightest clue how to govern. I climbed into the cab of my 2012 Toyota Tacoma, the interior smelling of sun-baked upholstery and the faint, permanent scent of Gojo industrial hand cleaner. I didn't turn on the air conditioning. I wanted to feel the 104-degree Arizona heat. I wanted it to sear the memory of that boardroom laughter into my skin so I would never, for a single second, forget the coldness of my father's dismissal. The $45 toolkit sat on the passenger seat, a cheap plastic box from a harbor freight sale, yet it felt heavier than any gold trophy Ethan had ever been handed. Inside were the tools of a trade my father despised. A set of chrome vanadium sockets, a rusted pair of needle-nose pliers, and a ball-peen hammer with a notched wooden handle. These were not just tools, they were my leverage. While Harrison was busy toasted to Ethan's unearned succession with vintage Krug champagne, I was already calculating the mechanical failures that were about to paralyze his logistics empire. I knew the maintenance logs better than the lead mechanics. I knew that the fleet of 220-24 Peterbilt 579s was overdue for a software patch on their emissions systems that only I had the proprietary diagnostic codes to bypass efficiently. I knew which transmission sensors were prone to failing in the extreme heat of the Mojave runs, and I knew that without my preventative scheduling, the Sterling fleet would be a graveyard of broken steel within 18 months. I pulled out of the resort, the tires of my truck humming against the desert road as I headed toward the outskirts of Phoenix. I didn't go back to the mansion in Scottsdale. I went straight to the industrial district, a place of corrugated metal warehouses and flickering sodium lamps, where I had secretly leased a 2,000-square-foot bay with the last of my savings. It was a cavernous, oil-stained space that smelled of old coolant and ambition. I walked to the center of the concrete floor, dropped the plastic toolkit, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. This was my boardroom now. Every hour I had spent working 65 hours a week for $18 an hour had been a rehearsal for this moment. I wasn't just a mechanic. I was a specialist in the systems that kept the world moving, and Harrison Sterling was about to find out that a company is only as strong as its weakest link, and he had just promoted the weakest link to CEO. The plan was already vibrating in my mind with the frequency of a high-performance engine. Step 1 was the specialized contracts. Sterling Logistics survived on high-volume, low-margin freight, but the real money lay in precision transport, oversized medical equipment, delicate aerospace components, and hazardous materials that required specialized cooling systems. Harrison hadn't touched those because they required technical oversight. He didn't understand. I sat at a makeshift desk, a plywood sheet over 2 chemical drums, and opened my laptop. The blue light reflected off the grease under my fingernails, a badge of honor I no longer felt the need to hide. I began drafting the articles of incorporation for Sterling Advanced Engineering. It was a predatory name designed to sit right next to his in the trade directories, a constant reminder of the daughter he had exiled to the pit. Over the next few weeks, the desert heat became my constant companion as I worked through the nights. I reached out to the owner-operators I had befriended over the last 5 years, the men and women who actually drove the trucks and hated the corporate bureaucracy Harrison had installed. I offered them something my father never would, a partnership based on mechanical integrity. I told them I would handle their fleet maintenance at cost if they brought their premium contracts to my new brokerage. One by one, the drivers who knew the Sterling name was becoming synonymous with unreliable under Ethan's burgeoning mismanagement began to jump ship. They didn't care about the gala or the Tom Ford tuxedos. They cared that I could diagnose a faulty DEF sensor over the phone at 2 a.m. while they were stranded in a rest stop outside of Needles, California. The financial contrast remained stark. While Ethan was seen on Instagram at the Wynn Las Vegas, dropping $15,000 on a single table in the high-limit lounge, I was accounting for every bolt and every liter of synthetic oil. My monthly overhead was $6,000, and for the first 3 months, I paid myself nothing, living off ramen and the adrenaline of pure spite. I watched from the shadows as the first cracks appeared in the Sterling Logistics facade. A major shipment of refrigerated pharmaceuticals for a clinic in Sedona was lost because a cooling unit failed, a unit I had warned Harrison needed a new compressor 6 months prior. The loss was $280,000 in cargo alone, not to mention the hit to their insurance premiums. When the news hit the industry wires, I didn't celebrate with champagne. I picked up my wrench and went back to work on a 2021 Freightliner Cascadia, humming a quiet tune as I tightened the manifold bolts to exact specifications. I remember the smell of that summer, the metallic tang of welding sparks, and the heavy, sweet scent of blooming creosote bushes after a monsoon rain. It was the smell of a changing tide. Every time I saw a Sterling truck on the I-10, I checked the mud flaps and the lights, noting the lack of care, the flickering LEDs, and the grinding sounds of poorly lubed fifth wheels. The company was rotting from the top down, just as I knew it would. Ethan was trying to implement synergy and digital transformation, while the actual hardware was screaming for mercy. My father was so blinded by his desire for a male heir that he couldn't see his empire was being held together by duct tape and the fading momentum of his own reputation. I was building a ghost fleet. By the end of the first year, I had 12 specialized rigs under my management, each one maintained to a level of perfection that would have made a NASA engineer blush. My clients were the ones Harrison had ignored, small tech firms and specialized manufacturers who couldn't afford a single hour of downtime. I charged them a premium, and they paid it gladly because they knew that Chloe Sterling's name on a manifest meant the cargo would arrive, regardless of the Arizona sun or the steep grades of the Salt River Canyon. I was no longer sleeping on a $50 mattress. I had moved into a modest but clean apartment closer to the shop, but I kept the old mattress in the back of the warehouse. I wanted to see it every morning to remind myself of the scent of burnt coffee and the feeling of being underestimated. The real shift happened when I caught wind of the Western Regional Logistics Summit. Harrison was scheduled to give the keynote address, a victory lap for 40 years of family-led excellence. I knew he would be looking for investors to cover the mounting debt Ethan was accruing. I also knew that the chairman of the regional board was a man named Marcus Vance, a mechanical purist who hated the modern trend of spreadsheet management. I spent my last $4,000 on a single, perfectly tailored charcoal suit and a professional detailing for my Tacoma. I wasn't going there to protest. I was going there to demonstrate the difference between an owner who wears a suit and an owner who knows how the suit is made. Standing in the lobby of the convention center, the air conditioning a frigid 68 degrees, I saw my father and Ethan across the room. They looked like the icons of success, polished, tanned, and radiating an unearned confidence. Harrison saw me and his eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, perhaps recognition, perhaps annoyance, passing over his face before he turned back to his circle of sycophants. He still thought I was in the pit. He didn't realize that the pit had given me the perfect vantage point to see the foundation of his building crumbling. I waited until Marcus Vance was alone near the coffee station, stepped up beside him, and didn't talk about vision or legacy. I talked about the specific failure rates of the 12-speed automated manual transmissions in the current Peterbilt fleet, and how my proprietary maintenance algorithm had reduced downtime by 22% for my clients. Vance stopped mid-sip, his eyes sharp. He looked at my hands, still showing the faint, permanent staining of oil around the cuticles, and he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had finally found someone who spoke his language. That conversation lasted 20 minutes, but it effectively ended the sterling monopoly in the Southwest. The grease monkey wasn't just fixing cars anymore. She was beginning to fix the entire industry, one precision-engineered contract at a time. The temperature inside the cabin of my 2008 Ford F-150 had dropped significantly as the desert night deepened, the plastic dashboard creaking under the rapid cooling of the Arizona air. But I barely felt the chill as I sat parked in the far corner of a 24-hour Denny's parking lot off Interstate 10. The flickering neon yellow sign of the diner cast a rhythmic, sickly glow over my cramped workspace, illuminating the layers of dust on my dashboard and the pile of greasy receipts tucked into the door pocket that represented every penny I had scraped together in the last few months. My laptop, a ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook I had bought secondhand from a government auction because I knew it could survive the grime of a garage floor, whirred loudly on my lap, its cooling fan struggling to keep up with the massive spreadsheets I had open. I spent that entire night deconstructing the Sterling Logistics Annual Report, a document thick with glossy photos of my father looking decisive and Ethan looking professional. But beneath the high-resolution images of shiny new trucks lay a mathematical rot that made my stomach churn with a mixture of disgust and cold, predatory excitement. As I scrolled through the hundreds of pages of fine print, the cracks in the sterling foundation began to widen into chasms, revealing a reality that the high society guests at the gala could never have imagined behind the champagne and the mahogany. The first major fracture was the debt structure, a staggering $42 million in predatory loans with escalating interest rates that were tied to the prime rate plus 6%. A desperate move Harrison had clearly made to maintain the appearance of growth while the core business was actually stagnating. These weren't standard commercial lines of credit from reputable banks like Chase or Wells Fargo. These were high-risk bridge loans from private equity vultures who were likely salivating at the thought of a default. I cross-referenced the equipment logs and realized the situation was even worse than the balance sheet suggested, as the report claimed a modern, efficient fleet. But my intimate knowledge of the yard told me the truth. Over 60% of the long-haul trucks were aging 2018 models with over 250,000 miles on their odometers, vehicles that were rapidly approaching the point of mechanical expiration. I knew exactly what that meant in terms of maintenance costs, knowing that at that mileage, the Eaton-Fuller transmissions would start dropping gears and the Cummins X15 engines would begin blowing head gaskets with expensive regularity. Harrison was reporting these assets at their purchase value, ignoring the reality that they were effectively rolling scrap metal that would require millions in capital expenditure to replace, money the company clearly did not have. The most galling discovery, however, was buried deep within the travel and entertainment expenses under a subheading for international market development. I tracked a series of wire transfers that led directly to Ethan's business trips to Macau, ostensibly to negotiate trans-Pacific shipping routes, but the numbers told a much darker story of personal excess and corporate theft. In a single quarter, Ethan had drained $850,000 from the company coffers, a sum that included $40,000 a night suites at the Wynn Palace and mysterious cash withdrawals that occurred almost exclusively between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning. He wasn't building a shipping empire in the East. He was gambling away the salaries of the mechanics who worked in the pits and the drivers who risked their lives on the icy passes of the Rockies. He was treating the company like a personal piggy bank, while the men and women on the front lines were being told that there was no budget for new tires or safety upgrades. I felt a surge of cold fury as I realized that the $145,000 Porsche my father had bought him was just the tip of a very large, very corrupt iceberg. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the screen reflecting off my glasses, and realized with a sudden bone-deep clarity that my family wasn't the invincible empire Harrison pretended it was. They were a fragile house of cards built on a foundation of lies, held together by nothing but the momentum of a dying reputation, and a light breeze of scrutiny would be enough to bring the entire structure screaming down. The humiliation I had felt at the gala, the sting of being called a grease monkey, and the years of being treated like a second-class citizen suddenly evaporated, replaced by a sense of immense clinical power. I wasn't the victim of their success anymore. I was the witness to their impending failure, and I held the map to every single one of their landmines. I reached out and touched the worn, leather-wrapped steering wheel of my Ford, the stitching frayed and the surface smooth from years of my own hard work, and I felt a sense of kinship with the machine that I would never feel with the people who shared my DNA. I whispered to the steering wheel in the silence of the cab, my voice sounding like gravel in the quiet night, saying that I'm not a daughter anymore, I'm a creditor. The transition in my mind was absolute and irreversible, a cold recalibration of my entire identity from a discarded child to a calculating hunter who was about to start collecting on a lifetime of debt. I began to see every insult from my father and every arrogant sneer from Ethan not as emotional wounds, but as line items on a ledger that would eventually be settled in full, with interest. I spent the remaining hours before dawn mapping out the legal entities I would need to form to begin purchasing the distressed debt of Sterling Logistics through third-party shells, ensuring that my name would never appear on a single document until it was too late for them to stop me. I knew that if I could acquire just 15% of those predatory loans, I could trigger a series of covenants that would force an external audit. An audit that Ethan's Macau receipts and Harrison's inflated asset values would never survive. I was going to use the very tools they despised me for, my technical knowledge, my attention to detail, and my willingness to stay in the grease and the dirt, to dismantle their world brick by brick. As the first hints of a bruised purple dawn began to creep over the horizon of the Phoenix Valley, I watched the long-haul drivers pulling their rigs out of the diner parking lot, their engines roaring to life with a sound like thunder. I watched them with a new perspective, knowing that soon I wouldn't just be the girl who fixed their trucks. I would be the woman who owned the company that signed their paychecks. I closed my laptop with a satisfying click, the sound echoing in the small space of the truck, and leaned my head back against the seat, feeling a strange sense of peace that I hadn't known in 15 years. The 2008 Ford F-150 might have looked like a relic to my father, a piece of junk compared to his luxury SUVs, but it was a fortress of honesty in a world of sterling-branded deception. I wasn't afraid of the work ahead, nor was I afraid of the poverty that still nipped at my heels, because I had something Harrison and Ethan lacked, the ability to see the world for what it actually was, rather than what I wanted it to be. I put the truck in gear, the transmission engaging with a solid, reassuring thud that I had tuned myself, and pulled out onto the highway, merging into the flow of traffic as the sun finally broke over the mountains. The $88 balance in my checking account didn't feel like a limitation anymore. It felt like the seed money for a revolution. I drove toward my small, grease-stained shop with a smile that never reached my eyes. A predator's smile, thinking about the look on Harrison's face when he realized that the grease monkey he had exiled was the one holding the keys to his mahogany boardroom. I was going to buy his life at a discount, not out of a desire for his luxury, but out of a requirement for justice, ensuring that the Sterling name would finally stand for something real, even if I had to burn the old version to the ground to make it happen. The night had ended, and the time for mourning my family was over. Now was the time for the meticulous, professional, and utterly ruthless business of taking back everything they thought I wasn't worth. I was Chloe Sterling, and I was no longer waiting for a seat at the table because I was busy building a new one where the only currency was competence and the only language was the truth. For 15 long, grueling years, I meticulously constructed Vanguard Transit from the skeletal remains of my former life, beginning with that single, oil-leaking 2012 Toyota Tacoma and transforming a desperate ambition into a dominant empire of 240 cutting-edge automated electric haulers. I didn't just build a trucking company. I built a technological fortress that made the traditional diesel-choked model of Sterling Logistics look like a decaying relic of the Industrial Revolution. While my father, Harrison, was still clinging to his outdated fleet and his pride, I was securing private contracts with semiconductor manufacturers in the Taiwan-Arizona corridor, operating out of a high-tech hub that hummed with the quiet, efficient whir of lithium-ion batteries and proprietary AI routing software. To ensure my father's downfall was as precise as a surgical strike, I hired Sarah Jenkins, a relentless forensic auditor with a reputation for smelling financial rot through 3 layers of shell companies, and I paid her a premium salary of $120,000 a year to do nothing but track every single desperate move Harrison Sterling made. Sarah was my eyes inside the burning building of my family's legacy, providing me with monthly dossiers that detailed the accelerating collapse of their empire, from the missed interest payments on those $42 million predatory loans to the quiet liquidation of my mother's jewelry collection to cover payroll. By the arrival of 2026, the data was undeniable. Sterling Logistics was no longer a business, but a financial black hole bleeding out from a staggering $195 million in debt, much of it tied to Ethan's catastrophic mismanagement and his continued draining of corporate funds for his lavish, hollow lifestyle. I watched through Sarah's reports as the end approached, seeing the bank's patience finally evaporate as Sterling Logistics defaulted on their primary credit line with a major institutional lender. The bank didn't care about the 40 years of history or the mahogany tables. They cared about the collateral, and they triggered a distressed asset auction that was set to take place in the spring of 2026. I prepared for that day with the cold, calculated focus of a grandmaster, liquidating my own non-core assets and securing a massive capital injection from the venture firms that had been trying to buy into Vanguard Transit for years. On the morning of the auction, I didn't go to a courthouse or a dusty boardroom. I sat in a sterile, glass-walled executive office on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper in downtown Phoenix, a space where the air was filtered to a clinical purity, and the only sound was the faint hum of the server racks in the next room. The view from the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic look at the sprawling Valley of the Sun, the very desert where I had once been cast out as a grease monkey, but from this height, the cars looked like toys and the people like ants. I sat at a minimalist desk carved from a single slab of polished white quartz, staring at the digital clock on the wall as it blinked toward the inevitable. The atmosphere in that office was heavy with the silence of a long-awaited justice, a 15-year wait distilled into the ticking of a clock. I had a single laptop open before me, connected to a secure portal that displayed the auction status of the Sterling Logistics portfolio, which included the headquarters, the fleet, the patents, and the very name that had been used to humiliate me. At exactly 10 a.m., the digital auction opened and closed in a matter of seconds, as my bid had been pre-approved and was backed by the full weight of Vanguard's treasury. I reached out with a hand that did not shake, the skin still bearing the faint, permanent scars of my years in the repair pits, and signed the digital authorization for a wire transfer of $215 million. With that single keystroke, the money moved through the digital ether, a massive surge of capital that effectively erased Harrison Sterling's ownership and placed his entire life under my absolute control. The transaction was instantaneous, a clinical end to a decade and a half of silent warfare, and as the confirmation message flashed across the screen in a bright, unforgiving green, I felt a strange sense of equilibrium return to my world. The contrast between the grease-stained garage where I started and this high-altitude sanctuary of glass and light was a physical weight, a reminder of the sheer distance I had traveled through, the sheer force of my own will. I spent the next hour reviewing the transition documents, seeing the list of assets that now belonged to me, the 9,000-square-foot mansion in Scottsdale, the remaining Peterbilt trucks that were now my responsibility to repair or scrap, and the employment contracts for the 300 people who still worked for the company. I realized that within the hour, a legal team would be arriving at my father's office to inform him that his daughter was now his boss, his landlord, and his largest creditor. I thought about the smell of the Chanel No. 5 at the gala and the way the laughter had echoed in that ballroom, and I realized that I no longer felt the sting of those memories. They were simply data points in a successful acquisition. Sarah Jenkins entered the room, her sensible heels clicking on the polished concrete floor, and handed me a final summary of the Sterling family's personal liabilities, confirming that even their personal bank accounts were now subject to the liens I had purchased. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city streets where the 104-degree heat was already shimmering off the pavement, knowing that somewhere down there, Harrison and Ethan were still operating under the delusion that they were the masters of their universe. They had no idea that the foundation of their lives had just been pulled out from under them by the very person they had deemed worthless, because she knew how to use a wrench. I thought about my mother, who had remained silent while I was cast out, and I wondered if she would find her voice now that the luxury she traded her daughter for was gone. The $215 million wasn't just a purchase price. It was the final settlement of a debt that could never truly be repaid in currency, but could be finalized through the total transfer of power. I felt a profound sense of relief, not because I was wealthy, but because I was finally, undeniably free of the Sterling shadow. I was the architect of Vanguard Transit, the owner of my father's legacy, and the woman who had proven that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who understands exactly how things work from the inside out. The digital clock moved to 11:05 a.m., and I checked the notification on my phone. The legal teams had arrived at the Sterling headquarters. I imagined the look on my father's face as he read the name Chloe Sterling on the acquisition documents, seeing the realization dawn on him that the grease monkey had bought his entire world at a discount. I thought about Ethan, who probably didn't even have enough gas in his Porsche to get him to the next casino once his corporate cards were declined. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about the fundamental laws of mechanics. If you build something on a faulty foundation, it will eventually collapse under its own weight. I had simply been the one to measure the stress, identify the cracks, and wait for the precise moment when the structure could no longer hold. I turned away from the window and picked up my bag, ready to head down to the yard to oversee the decommissioning of the old Sterling diesel units and their replacement with my new, silent electric fleet. The journey from the pit to the penthouse had been paved with $45 toolkits and 65-hour work weeks, and as I walked out of that sterile office, I felt the weight of that history in every step. I was no longer defined by the disappointment of a father who failed to see my value. I was defined by the empire I had built with my own two hands. The Arizona sun was bright and uncompromising as I stepped out into the day, the heat hitting me like a familiar embrace, a reminder of the nights I spent in the back of my Ford F-150 dreaming of this exact moment. The Sterling name was mine now, but I would not use it to build monuments to my own ego. I would use it to build a future where competence was the only currency that mattered. I drove my Audi toward the industrial district, the engine purring with a perfection that only a master mechanic could achieve, leaving the ghosts of the Lakeside Country Club far behind in the rearview mirror. The debt was paid, the transfer was complete, and for the first time in 15 years, the Sterling name finally meant something real, something durable, and something that was built to last. I was Chloe Sterling, and I had just finished the most important repair job of my life, fixing a legacy that had been broken for far too long. The trap was set with a surgical precision that only someone who had spent 15 years studying the structural failures of both machines and men could manage. And the stage for this final reckoning was the top-floor executive boardroom of the Sterling Plaza in downtown Phoenix. The afternoon sun was a brutal, unforgiving glare outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, heating the glass until it hummed with a low-frequency vibration that matched the tension mounting in the hallway. My father, Harrison, and my brother, Ethan, arrived at 2 p.m. sharp, their entrance marked by the frantic clicking of heels from the few remaining assistants who hadn't yet been informed that their loyalty had been purchased by Vanguard Transit. Harrison was draped in his $6,000 charcoal Brioni suit, a garment that had always functioned as his armor, though today it seemed to hang a fraction too loose on his frame, betraying the weight he had lost as the walls of his empire began to cave in. He gripped a platinum-coated Mont Blanc Meisterstück pen in his right hand so tightly that his knuckles were as white as the bone china coffee cups on the side table, his hands shaking with a fine rhythmic tremor he couldn't quite mask, even with his practiced patrician posture. Ethan followed behind him, looking remarkably out of place in a slim-fit Armani suit that cost more than most of our drivers made in 6 months, his eyes darting around the lobby with a mixture of confusion and unearned arrogance. They expected to walk into that room and confront an anonymous private equity CEO, some faceless vulture from a firm like BlackRock or Vanguard who spoke only in the language of EBITDA and liquidation values. Harrison had spent the morning rehearsing a 45-minute presentation filled with carefully curated excuses and inflated projections, a desperate theatrical performance designed to convince the new owner to retain him as a senior consultant for $500,000 a year plus benefits. He truly believed that his name still held enough residual value to be worth a $500,000 ransom, that the legacy of Sterling Logistics was a ghost that only he could conjure. He had no idea that the woman who had already signed his termination papers was sitting less than 20 feet away, listening to the muffled sound of his voice through the soundproofed oak doors. I sat in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the boardroom table, a massive slab of African Macassar ebony that reflected the overhead LED lights like a dark, obsidian mirror. I had chosen my attire with the same care Harrison used for his galas, but my purpose was different. I wore a bespoke navy suit with a stark white shirt, no jewelry except for the 1968 Omega Speedmaster I had restored myself, a tool watch for a woman who valued timing above all else. The air in the room was chilled to a precise 66 degrees, and the only items on the table were a single glass of chilled mineral water and a thick black leather folder containing the forensic audit Sarah Jenkins had compiled. I heard the heavy latch of the door click open, and the silence that followed was the most expensive sound I had ever heard. My father and Ethan stepped into the room, their shadows stretching across the polished floor toward me, and for several long, agonizing seconds, the only sound was the hum of the building's HVAC system. Harrison didn't recognize me at first because the silhouette was wrong. He was looking for a man, a peer, or perhaps an older adversary. He began to speak, his voice projecting that hollow, booming authority he used when he was trying to sell a lie. "Gentlemen, I appreciate the promptness of this meeting, and I think you'll find that my insights into the regional logistics corridors are worth—" He stopped abruptly as I rotated the chair to face him. The words died in his throat, his mouth hanging slightly open as his brain struggled to reconcile the image of his discarded grease monkey daughter with the person sitting in the seat of absolute power. The silence deepened, becoming a physical weight that seemed to crush the air out of his lungs. "Chloe," he whispered, the name sounding like a question he was afraid to hear the answer to. Beside him, Ethan's face flushed a deep, embarrassed crimson, his gaze dropping to the floor as if he could hide from the reality of my presence. I didn't offer a greeting, nor did I invite them to sit. I simply watched them with a clinical, detached interest, noting the way the sweat was beginning to bead on Harrison's forehead despite the cold air of the room. I opened the black folder, the paper crisp and loud in the stillness, and began to read from the summary of the transition. "The $500,000 consultancy fee you were planning to request is denied," I said, my voice echoing with a flat, metallic clarity that lacked even a hint of malice. It was simply a statement of fact, like a diagnostic report on a blown engine. I continued, informing him that the company's internal investigation into the Macau wire transfers had been completed and that the findings had already been forwarded to the primary creditors and the insurance underwriters. Harrison's grip on his Mont Blanc pen finally failed, the expensive instrument clattering onto the ebony table and rolling toward me like a discarded relic. He looked at me, not as a father looks at a daughter, but as a drowning man looks at the shore he will never reach, realizing in that singular moment that the trap wasn't just this meeting, it was the last 15 years of his own arrogance. The room felt smaller as I laid out the terms of their total displacement, detailing how the Sterling name would be scrubbed from every rig, every warehouse, and every letterhead by the end of the business week. I watched Ethan shift uncomfortably in his designer shoes, the golden child now reduced to a bystander in the destruction of his own future, a future he had gambled away before he even understood its value. I told them that the $19,000 a month lease on their Scottsdale offices was being terminated immediately, and that security was currently downstairs waiting to escort them from the building once they surrendered their corporate keys and devices. Harrison tried to speak, his voice cracking as he reached for the remnants of his dignity, asking how I could do this to my own family, to the man who gave me my start. I leaned forward, the Macassar ebony cool beneath my forearms, and reminded him that he didn't give me a start. He gave me a pit and a wrench and told me I was a disappointment. I told him that family is a structural bond built on mutual support, and when he removed the supports 15 years ago, the collapse became an engineering certainty. I watched as the realization fully took hold, the facade of the Brioni suit finally failing to protect him from the cold truth that he was now an outsider in the empire he had built. He looked around the boardroom, at the expensive art and the high-tech displays, seeing for the first time that everything in the room was a testament to my success, not his legacy. I stood up, the meeting effectively over before Harrison had even had the chance to open his briefcase, and I told him that I had already purchased the outstanding personal debt on the mansion, but out of a sense of professional courtesy, I would give them 30 days to vacate the premises before the foreclosure proceedings were finalized. I wasn't doing it because I loved them. I was doing it because I wanted them to have exactly 1 month to sit in that 9,000-square-foot monument to their failure and listen to the silence of a house that no longer belonged to them. The exit was as quiet as the entrance was loud. Harrison didn't argue, didn't beg, and didn't look back. He simply turned and walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped and his gait heavy, a man who had finally run out of road. Ethan followed him like a ghost, his hands stuffed into his pockets, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne that felt like a lingering insult to the hard work that had actually paid for the room. As the door clicked shut behind them, I sat back down in the head of the table and took a sip of the mineral water, the coldness of it refreshing and sharp. I looked at the digital clock on the wall, seeing that the entire encounter had taken less than 15 minutes, 30 years of Sterling history dismantled in a fraction of the time it took to change the oil on a semi-truck. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen Harrison had dropped, felt its weight for a moment, and then dropped it into the trash can beside the desk. I was Chloe Sterling, and the transition was complete. The old machines had been hauled away, and the new era of Vanguard Transit was ready to roll out into the Arizona sun, fueled by the precision of a woman who knew exactly what it cost to be the person sitting at the head of the table. The heavy mahogany doors of the Sterling Plaza executive boardroom swung open with a silent, hydraulic grace, and I stepped into the room that had once been the altar of my father's vanity, but was now the site of his final deposition. I wasn't the oil-smeared girl in the repair pit anymore. I was a figure of absolute, uncompromising authority, dressed in a bespoke black wool and silk suit tailored to the millimeter, and a pair of $900 Christian Louboutin pumps that clicked against the marble threshold with the precision of a ticking time bomb. There was no grease under my fingernails, no scent of diesel on my skin, only the faint, expensive trail of Barredo's Mojave Ghost and the cold, sharpened steel reflected in my eyes. I walked past the row of empty Eames chairs and took my place at the head of the Macassar ebony table, the very seat Harrison had occupied for 4 decades, while he systematically eroded the dignity of anyone who didn't share his last name. I didn't wait for him to speak, nor did I acknowledge the stunned, hollow expression on his face as he realized that the savior he had been praying for was the daughter he had tried to erase. "Hello, Harrison. I hear you're looking for a job," I said, my voice cutting through the chilled air like a razor through silk as I slid a 30-page forensic audit report, bound in heavy black cardstock, across the glass-topped surface of the table. The room was so quiet that the only audible sound was the high-efficiency HVAC system humming at a barely perceptible 22 decibels, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to amplify the crushing weight of the silence. Harrison stared at the report as if it were a venomous snake, his fingers twitching toward the platinum Mont Blanc pen he had dropped earlier, while Ethan sat beside him, his face drained of color and his expensive Armani jacket suddenly looking like a cheap costume. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to because the numbers on those pages were louder than any scream I could have mustered during the 15 years of my exile. I opened my copy of the report to the first of many highlighted markers and began to read, my tone as clinical and detached as a surgeon pronouncing a terminal diagnosis. Section 4. Page 12, I began, the words echoing off the soundproofed walls. You diverted $3.2 million from the Employee Pension Fund, a fund intended for the retirement of mechanics and drivers who have given 30 years to this company to cover Ethan's gambling markers at the Bellagio in Las Vegas over the course of 18 months. I watched as Harrison's chest constricted, his sallow skin turning a sickly shade of gray under the bright LED recessed lighting. He tried to open his mouth to offer one of the excuses he had spent 45 minutes rehearsing, but I didn't give him the space to breathe, turning the page with a crisp, rhythmic snap. Section 9, I continued, my eyes locked on his. You forged my grandmother's signature on the deed of the Scottsdale estate to secure a third mortgage, a document that Sarah Jenkins verified through 3 independent handwriting experts and a chemical analysis of the ink, which proves the signature was added 3 years after she was buried in the family plot. This wasn't just corporate mismanagement. It was a litany of felonies, a systematic dismantling of every legal and moral boundary that Harrison had ever pretended to uphold. The $3.2 million he had stolen from his own workers was the ultimate betrayal of the salt-of-the-earth image he had cultivated at the country club, and the look of sheer, pathetic terror in his eyes was the only interest I required on the debt he owed me. The audit report was a masterpiece of financial destruction, detailing every lunch, every luxury car lease, and every offshore wire transfer that Ethan had initiated while the company's actual infrastructure was literally falling apart on the highway. I pointed to the line items showing that while I was sleeping on a used mattress in a room that smelled like old tires, my brother was spending $50,000 on a single weekend at the Monaco Grand Prix, billed as a research and development expense. I read the figures for the repair logs I had managed years ago, showing how Harrison had ordered the falsification of safety inspections to keep aging rigs on the road, a move that had directly led to 3 major litigation settlements that were hidden behind non-disclosure agreements and paid for through further predatory loans. Every word I spoke was a nail in the coffin of the Sterling legacy, a legacy that was currently being liquidated in real time as the wire transfer I signed at 10 a.m. cleared the final hurdles of the banking system. Ethan finally broke, his voice a high-pitched, desperate whine as he started to say that it wasn't his fault, that Dad told him it was part of his inheritance, but I silenced him with a single, sharp glance that made him recoil into his chair. I told him that in my company there is no such thing as an inheritance of theft, and that the only thing he would be inheriting today was a mountain of personal liability and a permanent ban from every Sterling-managed property in the country. Harrison looked at the report, then up at the daughter he had called a grease monkey, and for the first time in my life, I saw him see me. He didn't see a disappointment or a failed investment. He saw the predator he had unintentionally created, a woman who had taken the grit and the dirt he gave her and forged it into a weapon of absolute precision. He reached for his water glass, but his hand shook so violently that the ice clinked against the crystal, a frantic, rhythmic sound that was the only thing breaking the 22-decibel hum of the room. I stood up, the 30-page report remaining on the table as a permanent record of his shame, and I walked to the window to look out at the fleet of Vanguard automated haulers parked in the staging yard far below, their white roofs gleaming like a new future. I told them that the police and the SEC had already been briefed, and that while I had no interest in seeing my mother lose her home, the Scottsdale estate was now a Vanguard asset, and she would be permitted to stay only as a guest of my choosing, provided she finally found the courage to speak the truth. As for Harrison and Ethan, I informed them that their security badges had already been deactivated and that the black SUVs waiting downstairs weren't there to take them to the country club, but to the local precinct where Sarah Jenkins was waiting with the original signed affidavits. I didn't feel joy, and I didn't feel sadness. I felt the profound, quiet satisfaction of a machine that had finally been calibrated to its perfect operating temperature. The contrast between the 40th anniversary gala and this moment was absolute. Back then, I was the one walking out into the 104-degree night with a $45 toolkit. But today, they were the ones being escorted out into the heat with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the weight of their own crimes. I turned back to the table and picked up my leather folder, leaving the brioni-clad shells of my former family to contemplate the numbers I had just read to them. I told Harrison that he was right about one thing 15 years ago. Well, I did belong in the pit, because in the pit, you learn how to fix things that are fundamentally broken, and today I had finally finished fixing the Sterling name. I walked out of the boardroom, the Louboutin pumps echoing with a final triumphant click on the marble, and as the heavy mahogany doors closed behind me, I felt the last of the Sterling shadow evaporate into the filtered 22-decibel air of my new empire. My name is Chloe Sterling, and I am no longer a daughter, a mechanic, or a disappointment. I am the owner of the truth, and the truth is the only thing in this room that isn't for sale. I stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut on the past, and as I descended toward the lobby, I realized that for the first time in 34 years, I could finally breathe without the scent of my father's lies clogging my lungs. The debt was settled, the audit was closed, and the only thing left to do was drive into the sunset in a world that I had rebuilt, bolt by bolt and dollar by dollar, until it was finally perfectly mine. Harrison's face turned a sickly, mottled gray, the exact color of wet concrete on a rainy afternoon in a shipyard, and for the first time in 34 years, the man who had always used his voice as a weapon of suppression found himself utterly silenced. He tried to speak, his throat working convulsively behind his silk tie, but no words materialized, only a dry, desperate wheeze that sounded like a failing intake valve on an old, neglected engine. The arrogant tilt of his chin had completely vanished, replaced by a sagging, heavy defeat that made him look every bit of his 65 years, and his eyes, once sharp with the cold fire of judgment, were now glazed with the sheer, blinding terror of a man who realized he was no longer the architect of his own destiny. I leaned in across the Macassar ebony table, the scent of the expensive wood and the clinical coolness of the air conditioning creating a bubble of intense, vibrating tension between us. I spoke in a low, level tone that carried more weight than any shout ever could, telling him that he had exactly 24 hours to vacate the Scottsdale house, and that every single item within those 9,000 square feet was now legally a possession of Vanguard Transit. I watched the realization sink into his skin as I listed the assets he was losing in real time, explaining that the custom-made Italian furniture, the 2024 chalk gray Porsche Turbo S he had bought to replace Ethan's mistake, and the $40,000 climate-controlled wine cellar filled with vintages he would never taste again were all now line items on my company's balance sheet. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of physical things to insulate himself from his own failures, and in one 15-minute meeting, I had stripped it all away with a series of digital signatures and a 30-page audit. "You wanted me in a pit, Harrison," I said, my voice as steady as the rhythmic hum of the building's infrastructure, and you were so busy looking down on me that you didn't notice you were the one holding the shovel. Well, congratulations, because you have finally finished digging your own, and the only difference is that I know how to climb out of the dirt, and you never will." I saw his hand reach out as if to touch the mahogany table one last time, a pathetic gesture of longing for a world that had already moved on without him. But he pulled back when he saw the lack of empathy in my expression. Ethan sat beside him, the golden child now reduced to a shivering wreck of a man, his eyes darting toward the security guards standing by the door as if he expected to be handcuffed on the spot. I didn't even grant him the dignity of a direct address. He was a footnote in the ledger, a mechanical failure that had simply been replaced by a more efficient component. I stood up, the sharp click of my $900 Christian Louboutin pumps echoing with a final, definitive authority that signaled the end of the Sterling era. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sprawling Phoenix skyline where the desert sun was beginning to cast long, obsidian shadows over the valley. I thought about the 19-year-old girl who had walked away from the Lakeside Country Club in the dark, her hands covered in grease and her heart heavy with the weight of her father's disappointment. And I realized that the weight was finally gone, transferred entirely to the men sitting at the table behind me. Today, I run Vanguard Transit, the largest and most technologically advanced logistics firm in the Southwest, overseeing a fleet of 240 automated electric haulers that operate with a precision Harrison Sterling could never have understood. My life is a testament to the fact that competence is the only true currency, and that the people who try to bury you often end up providing the very soil you need to grow into something they can no longer contain. The Scottsdale mansion is currently being converted into a corporate retreat and training center for our lead technicians, a place where people who actually know how to build things are treated with the respect they deserve. My mother moved out 3 days after the auction, finally taking a small apartment in Sedona, with the modest inheritance she had managed to hide from Harrison. And though we speak occasionally, the silence of those 5 years remains a canyon between us that may never fully be bridged. The most poetic part of the collapse, however, is the mundane reality of their new lives, a reality that lacks the grand drama Harrison always craved. My father now lives in a cramped, rented 2-bedroom apartment in a nondescript complex in Mesa, a place where the walls are thin and the view is of a dusty parking lot rather than a manicured golf course. He spends his days dealing with the legal fallout of the pension fund theft, his once pristine Brioni suits now wrinkled and smelling of the cheap coffee he drinks in the courthouse cafeteria. He is no longer a titan of industry. He is a cautionary tale, a man who traded his soul for an empire he didn't know how to maintain. Ethan, the brother who once laughed at my oil-stained fingernails and crashed 6-figure cars without a second thought, now spends his 40-hour weeks working as a valet at a high-end hotel in Paradise Valley. He stands in the heat for minimum wage, opening the doors of cars he will never own for people who don't know his name, his hands now forced to handle the very machinery he once viewed with such unearned contempt. I recently drove my Audi RS6 into that very hotel for a charity event, and I watched through the rearview mirror as Ethan took the keys from my hand, his head bowed so low I could only see the sweat on the back of his neck. He didn't look up, and I didn't say a word, but as I walked toward the entrance, I felt the symmetry of the universe settle into place with a satisfying mechanical click. The grease monkey had become the creditor, and the golden boy had become the servant, a perfect inversion of the hierarchy Harrison had tried to set in stone 15 years ago. My journey wasn't fueled by a desire for their money or their houses, but by a need to prove that the structural integrity of a person is measured by what they can survive, not by what they are given. I am Chloe Sterling, 34 years old, and I have learned that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tells you that you don't belong at the table is to wait until they are finished eating, buy the restaurant, and then change the locks. The story of my family is over, but the story of Vanguard Transit is just beginning. A future built on the hard, cold reality of technical excellence and a refusal to ever underestimate the power of the person in the pit. I sat in my office late that night, the city lights shimmering below like a sea of fallen stars, and I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any victory. I had not just won a war, I had corrected a fundamental error in the system. Family is not defined by the blood that flows through your veins, but by the loyalty and respect that is earned through the work you do together. And since that was a lesson Harrison and Ethan were incapable of learning, they were never truly my family to begin with. I am the architect of my own life, a precision instrument of my own making, and as I looked at the dark, quiet boardroom where it all ended, I realized that the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the future. A future where the only thing that matters is the truth of the machine and the strength of the hands that know how to fix it. I closed the black leather folder, stepped out into the night, and drove away from the Sterling Plaza, leaving the ghosts of my past to haunt the rented apartments and valet stands where they finally belonged. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and at my table, the truth has finally found a permanent home.